Thank you. When we left just before lunch, we were talking about the SAC committee and funding and budgets. Who is responsible for approving the final budget, Dr. Riddle?
Well, the final approval is at the Regional Executive Management Committee.
And is that based on recommendations from SAC as a whole?
Yes. Annually, I would prepare a budget summary indicating what was covered, what the unfunded priorities might be, and basically send that up through the chain. That would be the sign-off for the budget.
Right, and I give an example of that at tab 8. Which is CAN 062201. This is, I take it, one of the notes that would find its way up to the Regional Management Committee for final decision?
Yes.
Okay. And just to identify some of the concerns that would be outlined in a briefing note like this, if we turn to the final page, you set out, sorry, not the final page, that is a table, but just before the table, yeah, that's right, CAN 03. At the top of the page, it sets out some options. Proceed with proposed assessment plan, including activities identified in Appendix 2. Number 2, proceed with proposed assessment plan, but cancel activities identified in Appendix 2. And 3, engage Stock Assessment Management Board to determine final salmon assessment plan. And then a recommendation, and your recommendation at that time was, given the uncertainty in budgets for 2007-8, Dr. Riddell requested that each area reevaluate their projects and develop the plan in Appendix 2 that would deliver an assessment plan within the assumed budget. While each area and core assessment area has cooperated in this exercise, SAC notes that projects included in Appendix 2 represent a significant loss of information. Consequently, it's very difficult for SAC to recommend option 2, but in the absence of available relief funds and science, to our knowledge at this time, and in light of Paul Sprout's memo in early June, with pressure to continue to reduce your operating costs.
Yes, and earlier in that page, you see there was a table of the allocations in previous years, and in that table it's bolded because, as we've talked about this morning, when we were doing this process, we wouldn't know the final budget, but we would have a notional budget. And that I would typically work with the staff to come down to the best solution we could, but you're always going to come in with a number of projects that you can't quite fund, and that's the intention of providing this summary document with some options for senior management.
Okay, and just looking at that table, what are the abbreviated letters there? S&W, SK, O&M, SK?
S&W is salary and wages, and then O&M is operating and maintenance.
Okay, and then we see A-base, which we've talked about already, and PST, I take it that is the funding under the treaty?
Yes.
Which is B-based or A-based?
Well, it's a special allocation,
it's a special
right? So
allocation.
It's not a guaranteed ongoing fund, so it's not A-base.
But this is where you identified that certain funds in 1999 were moved into A-base, and then additional funds were available for the PST allocation. That's the distinction that we see here.
That's the PST, yes.
Okay. And then just to, thank you. Could I have that mark, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 382. Ms. Baker, could I just ask very briefly this question? I've heard a large body of evidence around pre-season, in-season, and post-season management, and all that falls under those headings. This is the first time I've gotten into this funding side. What exactly is covered by this area of funding? In other words, within the stock assessment plan, you mentioned forecasting, for example, and other areas. Is it all covered under this plan? What exactly is covered in it?
What's covered here is all stock assessment of salmon in the Pacific region, including the Yukon. And that, so when you heard forecasting described, and now we have Sue Grant is the person responsible for Fraser sockeye forecasting. Sue would be part of the salary and wages and have some operating funds. The basic operating funds here are the major annual projects for estimating escapements. They would not necessarily include in-season test fisheries, because a lot of that is under resource management, but it would include things like in the Skeena, for example, there's a long-standing Tyee test fishery in the river. That is part of stock assessment. Those things actually differ just due to the way things develop through time a little bit. But this is all of the core information that would be used in actually making assessments.
if I can add to that, from the Fraser perspective, it almost exclusively through this venue is the terminal area spawning escapement estimates. None of the test fisheries are funded through this route. In addition, none of the catch monitoring, which it could be considered a component of stock assessment, as it represents that calculation of total return. None of the catch monitoring programs are included here either, so they're under a different funding envelope.
So all of the programs that we just talked about first thing this morning, with the exception of the Chilco Smolt Post program that is being funded through a variety of sources, coordinated with the Salmon Foundation, all those programs are funded out of this budget.
Yes,
correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just wanted to go back to the treaty just to identify the areas that are covered off for DFO's management in this area. And if we have that at Exhibit 65, please. Copy of the treaty.
C2 DFO in 85. Paragraph F specifically speaks to the issue of the continuity of the enumeration methods, the collection of biosample data and population abundance information, as well as the extent of coverage that needs to occur to meet Canada's obligations to the management assessment framework, management objectives. It recognizes that estimation of total annual return is a component, and as such, escapement monitoring of all stocks is important. It also recognizes that for the perspective of continuity and method types to ensure precision and accuracy is consistent through time, that these approaches to enumeration are consistent as well.
And is this one of the objectives when you are looking at funding for stock assessment? Is this one of the priorities that you have to consider?
Yes, it's key.
Okay. We've talked today quite a bit about funding cuts, and I know funding cuts were discussed in December when Dr. Riddle was here earlier. The question I want to ask you on cuts right now is, there have been cuts in the past. What direction have you been given as to future planned cuts? Are future cuts planned for stock assessment, or are future planned cuts planned for government, which will have an impact on stock assessment?
In terms of this upcoming planning year, we're being advised that there are likely government-wide pressures associated with funding coming down. There are some notional targets that have been discussed in terms of potentials, and we're talking approximately 5% cuts right now as targets. But as Brian mentioned, through this process, it's quite iterative through the year. We see many potential changes to the budget until it ultimately is delivered in the August to October timeline. But there are talks of continued fiscal pressures on the budgets.
Could I just add, it's sometimes easy to forget exactly what 5% means, because the 5% expression now is 5% on total budgets. So it sounds like a fairly small percent. But you also have government guidelines where you're not allowed to reduce staff unless they're term field staff working in projects on a very short-term basis. So what that means to a senior manager is 5% of your total budget. Very broad terms, at least 70% of your total budget is likely taken up in salary. Well, salary, wages, benefits, and all that. And so really, you're looking at 5% of a total that turns into more like 15 to 20% of operating at times. All right, and so these small cuts have a very almost insidious way of accumulating to significant reductions in programs.
Okay, and the 5% that's being discussed, Mr. Whitehouse, is that 5% per year over a number of years, or is that 5% total over a number of years?
It's interesting question, because it hasn't been treated consistently through past years. In some years it's it compounds from year to year, so it's a 5% on a 5%. Sometimes it's represented 5% cut against a base level. So we have not got the understanding at this point in time, looking forward to know whether it's a compounded or a one-time assessment against a base reference level.
All right, thank you. And then just following up on your comment just now, Dr. Riddle, when you were here in December, you indicated that there had been cuts since 1999 in the range of 10 to 20%, and I take it this is on the global budget. Is that number, how does that number translate into cuts to the operating funds for stock assessment?
Well, when I made that comment, I was thinking in terms of the total budget allocation for all salaries and wages and operating and maintenance. And the total budget for the region could have been in the range of about 16.5, 16.8 is the highest value, and at times it's been as low as about 13.5. And then sometimes, of course, you get relief because there are special allocations. But when I use that percentage, I was using percent of total value, right? And so when that gets down to program costs, I have salaries that have to be paid, and then it would be translated into operating costs. So it'd be bigger than if you had 10% reduction on total, it could easily be 25% on operating.
And if your range that you were talking about earlier was 10 to 20%, then your range would be 25% plus for operational cuts. Is that fair?
Yes.
When we started this morning, we talked about the different programs that are operated through stock assessment, and we talked about what were originally in place with the old Salmon Commission and what changes had been made to those programs over time. And I just want to go through some of those and ask you whether those reductions, for the most part, those were reductions in programs, are a result of budget cuts. So first of all, I don't know that you had with respect to adult enumeration on the spawning grounds, you identified that aside from a few years where you were unable to complete a full assessment, that program has remained intact. Is that fair, Mr. Whitehouse?
That's correct, with
Okay.
the exceptions noted.
You also talked about cuts made to the juvenile program, so the FRI programs. Were those reductions made as a result of budget cut pressures?
Yes, the virtual elimination of FRI programs responded to budgetary pressures.
And you also talked about changes to the SMOLT program, juvenile assessment programs, that the years in which those were conducted have been reduced somewhat. Were those changes also as a result of budget cuts?
Yeah, referring specifically here to the in-lake hydroacoustic and trawl surveys and the limnological assessment of Fraser Lake's marked decrease in the amount of activity due to budget restraints. I think there's a number of things to think about in responding. I think the key is that the purpose of the various layers in terms of assessing different life history stages are explanatory power for identifying shifts in production trends, for example, changes in fish production patterns that could not be explained by simply tracking adults. So all of these components can be looked at as incremental add-ons to improve understanding and certainty with which we are able to provide advice, science-based advice to managers. As you remove the capacity to understand these life history-based studies, we reduce the ability to explain variation in patterns that we see.
The spreadsheet on the back was an attachment to the email. Do you have that document?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And this, if we turn to the spreadsheet, the summary of historical funding for stock assessment budgets, this covers the period 98-99 through to 05-06. And you'll see some fluctuations in the total allocations for the operational budgets starting in 98-99. The total is, I guess, in millions. Well, maybe you can tell me what is the sockeye total? Is that millions, or what's the value that we're
1.73 million
Okay.
in 1998-99. That's the sockeye total.
And then it drops by 400,000, stays more or less just a little bit more, goes up again, back up to 17, then down to 14, down to 8, down to 798. Is there some explanation you can give us as to those fluctuations in funding?
Yeah, I think there's some important patterns that need to be pointed out here. As we spoke earlier, sockeye funding needs based on the program profile and the number of high precision estimates required, linked to the expected abundance returning to the spawning grounds, fluctuates with cycles in Fraser sockeye abundance. So late run populations represent a increase in pressure. That's the 98, 99, 2000, 2003 cycle that you see here. The numbers which are elevated during those years represent increased costs associated with enumeration. In the years between that, there are reduced requirements, so the budgets commensurately are reduced to reflect that reduced need in terms of enumeration.
Right, and can I have this mark, please, that this combined documents as one exhibit?
Exhibits 383.
And what do those fluctuations year to year in funding requirements, does that create any difficulties in planning and difficulties in budgeting for the program?
It indeed does, associated with the fluctuation on that dominant year. Represents an increase in budget pressure that, while it should be foreseeable, given we know population abundance cycle across this 4-year pattern, the reality is, given the pressure on budgets, it has represented an additional burden to the regional assessment budgets that have been very difficult to accommodate.
So once people get used to funding at a lower level, you find it hard to get the money to go back up? Is that the problem?
Basically, in order to accommodate the increase in funding requirements on a dominant cycle year, there's no new money coming in. It means something has to fall off the table somewhere else. So the 400,000 increase approximately that you see, although it would be much greater in the latter years in this table, that increase is associated with lowering the priority on other projects that would have been delivered during the non-dominant year. And those aren't necessarily Fraser sockeye or even Fraser salmon programs. That would be accommodating Fraser sockeye interests ahead of a number of other species interests coast-wide.
Okay. And 2010 was a year where the numbers came back bigger than expected, or at least on the very high side of what was expected. What did that do? How was that accommodated within your programs?
Well, first off, we were planning process provided adequate budget for expected levels of abundance coming back in 2010. When we got signal early on in the season that abundances were going to be substantially greater than we had anticipated, I flagged this to the division head and said, I'm going to likely need substantial additional resources in order to be able to address this. And the department was able to identify these resources, so we did not have any gaps this year in terms of the program profile as implemented.
Has that been the case, that where you have had extraordinary needs, there has been money has been found to provide you with the resources that you need for at least managing the Fraser River stocks?
In most cases, yes. However, there are exceptions that are flagged in this table, for example, where we were unable to meet, due to budgetary constraints, the ability to deliver all necessary program elements.
And would one of those examples be the Horsefly River Quesnel, which you see there's a 0 with an asterisk beside it in the, I can't see the year, Sterling, can you just move it down? I think it was 2002, but if you can move the other direction, so we can see the top of the table. I think it's a 2002-2003 year. You see the Horsefly has a 0 with a star beside it, an asterisk, and at the bottom it says project was required but was unfunded and not delivered in 2002. Is that an example?
That is exactly an example thereof, yes.
And I'd like to just turn to the 2002 year. In 2002, you had that problem as identified with that stock, and there was a memo prepared. Excuse me, let me just find it. Tab 3. This is CAN 008206. This is an impact statement for budget challenges in 2002, 2003. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I'm the author.
Okay. And why was this document prepared?
It was a summary of the budgetary challenges in terms of program planning based on our first evaluation of likely budget status to come to our program in the 2002-2003 fiscal year.
Right, at the bottom of that first page, the last paragraph identifies that reductions of this magnitude will have a marked negative impact on management and assessment of Fraser River sockeye fisheries and population dynamics in the immediate and long term. The current configuration fails to meet Canada's obligations under the Salmon Treaty, some aspects of which have already been agreed to for 2002-2003 field season. Failure to adequately deliver the Fraser River sockeye enumeration program mandate will seriously erode client and stakeholder confidence in the department. And that was your view at that time?
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out the two bullets immediately above that, because that's not simply not delivering the quenelle, which was the ultimate outcome. At this point, and this was a May time meeting, we would have had no ability to enumerate summer runs in 2002, early summer runs, and no ability to assess 3 of the major 4 components of the summer run. So it would have represented a major hole in the stock assessment program. So between the time that this was drafted and the ultimate program delivery, there were a number of pieces of emergency relief funding that were delivered, such that 2 major gaps existed in the 2002 program. Quenelle, as was already highlighted, and Birkenhead, which was another component that was not estimated.
I'd like that memo marked, please. That's the next exhibit.
Exhibit 384.
And then 2, the concerns were raised also by the Salmon Commission itself. I want to ask you if you're familiar with the document that you can find at tab 13 of the binder. It's a Salmon Commission document. This was written in August 2002, and it's from Don Cole. If you could turn to the next page, please. Thank you. And this also identifies in the second paragraph on that page, the panel's most urgent and immediate request is for the reinstatement of critical assessment programs on the Quenelle River system for summer run sockeye, specifically the horsefly mark recapture study and the Quenelle Lake visual surveys. And it goes on. Were you aware of the concerns raised by the Salmon Commission at that time in 2002?
Specific timing of delivery of this document, I can't comment on. I would have been aware through the chain of communication that the Fraser panel and thus the management infrastructure would have been concerned about this. And I ultimately, at some point later in the season, would have seen this document.
Okay. Have that marked, please. That's the next exhibit.
Exhibit 385.
And what was the outcome of the 2002 year and the concerns which we've just identified in exhibits 384 and 385?
I think we've covered it, but just to restate, there was substantial relief funding to address gaps associated with earlier components of the program to address all early summer runs and most summer run components. But we did fall short and were unable to identify funding or a way to deliver programs associated with the Quenelle assessment and Birkenhead River assessment.
And did those reductions impact Fraser River sockeye management for that year?
They will, for a number of reasons stated earlier, associated with determination of total return and evaluating management performance, specifically with respect to summer run stocks, have had the impact of increasing the uncertainty with respect with which we could evaluate the fishery performance.
If you turn to the next tab, tab 14 in the binder, this is a memo from the Salmon Commission dated May 5, 2003. And again, in this letter, the Commission is reporting concerns from the panel with respect to planned reductions in stock escapement enumeration programs in 2003. There's a memo and a presentation attached to that, setting out some of the concerns raised by the Salmon Commission. If you can just flip through those pages. Do you remember an issue in 2003 with respect to planned reductions in stock escapement, or excuse me, escapement enumeration?
Yes, I do, and I would frame the context here, again, May timeline, so this would be early in the process. Considerable amount of uncertainty with respect to budgets, but the notional budgets that would have allocated were indicating significant problems in terms of our ability to deliver the full suite of assessment programs, and this would have been a response from the Salmon Commission and Canadian Commissioner, or Canadian and U.S. Commissioners, raising their concerns that something akin to 2002 was happening again.
And do you remember what the outcome was in 2003?
We were largely able to implement most of the assessment framework.
With the exception of Fraser Pinks. I would point out
That's a good point, yeah.
that is the first year that assessment was not done on Fraser Pink salmon, other than the fry downstream.
So the money for sockeye was pulled from pinks to a certain extent? Is that what happened, or was it just pinks eliminated?
Well, I can point out I wasn't there, so I can't really answer that.
That is a reasonable characterization, given the funding pressures across the region. We had to basically dig into the money used to fund pink to fund other higher priority items within the assessment framework.
Thank you. I'd like that document marked as next exhibit, please.
386.
When we talk about the priorities for funding and for stock assessment, I take it Fraser River sockeye is the top priority stock. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And the focus on maintaining programs for sockeye means that there are impacts on other species and that there's not enough money to perform full enumeration or assessment programs for those other species. Is that correct?
Yes, and it goes back to my earlier description about how the money is managed under the core funding and then the Pacific Salmon Treaty funding after '99. When the original funding for the Fraser sockeye, to a very large extent, was included in the '85 treaty, that money subsequently became A-based or core funding, and that then opened it up to departmental reductions for a number of national and more local pressures. And so when those pressures caused our budget to go down, then we would have to dip into the Pacific Salmon Treaty funding to ensure that we were meeting most of the requirements for Fraser sockeye salmon. And as Timber has described, to a very large extent, we have met those through the time, but there have been where we've tried to cut down so we minimize the loss on other populations.
Right, so some of the impacts would be the elimination, as you said, of pink enumeration, adult pink enumeration?
Yeah, pink has been an ongoing loss. It's our most numerous single population of salmon in Canada, and it's currently not assessed.
Okay. And then have there been reductions in chum, coho, and chinook assessments as well?
Yes, there have, yeah.
Okay, and we're here to talk about Fraser River sockeye, so let me ask you whether there's any impact on Fraser River sockeye from the diminished funding available to enumerate and assess those other stocks I just mentioned. And I could leave that, start maybe with Mr. Whitehouse.
I think there's a number of things that you have to think about because considering Fraser management, sockeye management, and recognizing it's not only a mixed stock in terms of numbers of sockeye populations impacted, but it's also a multi-species fishery where Chinook and coho are captured as a bycatch in sockeye-directed fisheries. If we lose the resolution to be able to identify either emerging conservation concerns due to cuts associated with reductions in Chinook or coho assessment, and coho is a very good example in the Fraser. If we lose the capacity to be able to inform management as to status of coho or Chinook stocks, we may be in a place where we have to unnecessarily constrain sockeye fisheries to deal with the uncertainty around status on co-migrating species. So there are implications that can be quite far-reaching in seeing a degradation in the information that is collected on other species as well.
Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Riddle?
Well, just to reinforce there could be ecological issues of extremely large pink salmon returns, and we have no assessments on that. I don't think that you could really tie many Chinook issues to it. Most of the fisheries are non-retention Chinook now in the large seine fisheries for sockeye. The conservation concern for Chinook and the Fraser is really on the early time component mostly, and that's not in conflict with fisheries on Fraser sockeye, including the early Stewart run. With the exception, I guess, of in-river management would be under consideration there. And the other one that we should note is, there is minimal assessment of southern BC chum and have been for a number of years. And again, because there hasn't been the sort of value placed on them, and they simply have not been closely monitored through time.
Can I just reinforce that I would like to clarify that there would potentially be significant impacts to in-rivers fishery management on a Chinook perspective, particularly for the upriver 5-year-old stocks, which are substantially impacted by a number of in-river fisheries.
And Fraser River stock assessment. We have, of course, heard about the wild salmon policy in these hearings, and we have heard discussions about CUs under that policy, and we touched a little bit on that this morning. Can the current levels of funding available for Fraser River stock assessment provide the information needed to evaluate and manage at a CU level?
Fraser sockeye, I think, is unique, and I think we have to step back to the discussion that we just had. We have the most robust and complete data series on Fraser sockeye. It's probably the strongest data set that exists on the eastern coast of North America. Eastern coast of the Pacific, I should say. And the ability to address WSP implementation is probably most robust there, as it is with respect to any species on the coast. However, I don't think when you talk about WSP implementation, you can simply take a single species focus. That WSP is an integrated planning and evaluation process that considers ecosystem and multi-species impacts. So we really have to be careful when we say fully implementing sockeye management under a WSP provision is adequately addressing salmon management coast-wide from a CU perspective, because it's quite a different perspective when we look at the quality of information outside of the Fraser, or even within the Fraser for non-sockeye CUs.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Riddell?
I would agree with Timber that for sockeye, I think you're probably in pretty good shape for doing the assessments, and he spoke to that earlier this morning. My only, I guess, caveat on that would really be when we do define the lower benchmarks, do we have adequate in-season assessments to ensure that certain conservation units are managed to, try and meet the lower benchmarks so that we don't have to implement major recovery efforts. There may be an assessment issue at that point. But I think that the broader point that Tim Burris just made about the other species and how they would affect fishing opportunities is the more important one.
To move to another new topic, looking at First Nations and involvement of First Nations in-river stock assessment. And again, these questions are primarily directed to Timber Whitehouse. First of all, I understand that some Fraser River First Nations have been involved in working with DFO to do stock assessment in the Fraser River watershed for sockeye and other salmon species.
That's correct. There's
And
quite extensive involvement.
could you describe what that involvement is?
Through a number of processes, but primarily supported through the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, DFO has undertaken capacity development as a major mandate with First Nations to participate in management and stock assessment. Numerous agreements throughout the watershed with First Nations support delivery of capacity development to allow First Nations to begin to work in a meaningful way in stock assessment projects.
Okay. And are you aware that some First Nations have asked for further involvement in Fraser River stock assessment projects in their traditional territories?
It's quite a common theme. We hear from First Nations on a regular basis that they would like to, their aspirations are a greater involvement with stock assessment.
Okay. And I'm just going to ask you to turn to tab 15 of the binder before you. It's an email, which it doesn't have a CAN number, but it's an email from Gord Starrett to you and others about stock assessment opportunities they'd like to pursue. Do you remember receiving this email? It's dated May 5, 2009.
Yes, I do.
Okay, can I have that mark, please?
Exhibit 387.
Okay, and in this email, Mr. Starrett says that it's been difficult to get stock assessment involved in discussions with his tribal council regarding greater involvement in stock assessment programs. Do you agree that that's an issue?
I think my perspective is slightly different. I think we have quite a productive working relationship. We've worked with the NSTQ for a large number of years in delivery of not only sockeye but other species assessments in their traditional area. I fully acknowledge that this note expresses a desire for increased participation.
He says in the second paragraph, second line, on the part of stock assessment, this engagement has been minimal to say the least. You don't agree with that?
No, I cannot. I think there's a number of examples that I can point to that indicate that we've been working fairly productively, although perhaps not as rapidly as Mr. Starrett would hope to see, towards developing capacity within First Nations in their area. There are specific funds set aside in their AFS agreement to specifically participate in sockeye assessment. We've worked with them in conjunction with other partners in terms of developing alternate assessment methodologies within the Quesnel. And that relates to the use and application of high-tech Didson counters in the main stem of the Quesnel. We have, in addition, directly hired members of the NSTQ as direct DFO staff to try and assist in developing their capacity further. So while it may not be enough progress, I think we have been working quite productively together to attempt to move forward on that capacity development.
I understand that the NSTC is involved in Chinook and Coho stock assessment. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and has the partnership with the DFO with respect to Fraser River sockeye been at the same level as their involvement in Chinook and Coho stock assessment?
You have to separate and understand the complexities of the programs to understand whether the engagement would likely be at the same level. The Coho program is a very simple one that involves the operation of a fence. The complexity of the assessment elements associated with sockeye on most years require a fair bit more technical integration and understanding. The components are quite closely linked to both marker capture and visual surveys. And as such, you're not comparing the same suite of skill sets in implementing the similar or the dissimilar project types.
Are you familiar with the in-season abundance and health indicator program that the NSTC, the Northern Shuswap Tribal Council, has?
Yes, I am.
And what do you think of that program? Has it got any usefulness to your programs?
It's largely structured not as a stock assessment tool per se, but its purposes of supporting in-season process for evaluation of in-season run strengths as opposed to terminal area assessments. It is structured to try and attempt to provide information on the condition of fish through capturing them on their migratory route up to terminal spawning areas, but before reaching them, and also to attempt to try and provide some sort of an indication of relative abundance. I think the concept is generally well-meaning. However, when talk with resource managers in terms of the utility of the information, right now it's not particularly well positioned to be providing advice that would assist managers in season.
And this is the fish wheel program that they are
Yes.
operating. Okay. Dr. Riddell, have you got any comments on the in-river assessment being done by First Nations?
No.
I wonder if I could ask Ms. Baker, either Dr. Riddell or Mr. Whitehouse, you use that term, the complexity of assessment components associated with sockeye. I wonder if one of you could just tell me the main characteristics that differentiate sockeye from the other species in terms of stock assessment. I realize sockeye spend longer in fresh water than some of the other species, but apart from that.
Yeah, certainly. Key is the relative complexity of population structure when we're talking about the enumeration of spawning populations. There are in excess of 80 distinct spawning sites spread throughout the Quesnel system, and there are two very major stocks that on 2 or 3 out of the 4 cycle years require the use of the high precision marker capture techniques or alternately Didson techniques, which we've been evaluating there. When we're dealing with marker capture program implementation, there is a large number of factors associated with bias evaluation that make it very critical that not only in the main population, let's use horsefly as the example, a body of fish that may be 1 million plus, centered amongst 60 or 70 other spawning streams that may be from a couple of hundred to several tens of thousands. While the general perception is that sockeye have high fidelity to their spawning streams, there is a lot of straying and mixing of those populations en route. Tagging programs are specifically prone to sources of bias if very careful care isn't made in structuring the programs that evaluate populations, the spawning sites outside of the main river, so outside of Horsefly River in this case, so that you get information on tagged to untagged fish. These are all relating to the bias and the reliability of the estimate. These programs have to be very carefully intertwined and linked. There cannot be significant breakdowns between the delivery of the marker capture and the delivery of the visual surveys, which are the low precision surveys on the streams outside the marker capture area, or you will be subject to significant negative bias. A great deal of coordination is required in order to deliver those programs, and as such, it doesn't make for a piece that is readily cleave offable. You can't cut off a piece to say, here's a piece of work that could be discrete and delivered through another mechanism without having a potential negative bias to the marker capture. So they're very closely intertwined, and this is the complexity. Coho enumeration, there are one or two populations that coho head to a single stream. The stream that they use in the horsefly system can be fenced using a very small temporary fence. A fence operation is very simplistic. It really simply needs someone sitting on the fence, manning it and counting fish through a passage in the fence. So you can stop fish migrating overnight, open the fence during the day and count the fish through visually one at a time. And there would be on the order of a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand fish at most. When you're dealing with sockeye populations in the horsefly system, horsefly quenelle, you're dealing with up to 2.5 million fish. So the order of magnitude reflects the complexity in terms of evaluating it.
Monitoring and assessment studies be continued to improve understanding of the effects of high spawner density, such as Adams River, and the migration behavior and in-river mortality among late-run sockeye. As well, external members of the steering committee advocate undertaking more extensive stock assessment studies on all Fraser River sockeye stocks. This I don't see in the response from the department a specific response. Do you know if anything was done in response to these recommendations, particularly the more extensive stock assessment studies, which were recommended for all Fraser River sockeye stocks?
I'll actually tackle the first one because it's quite clear that the department, through a number of partnerships with universities and consulting agencies, made a major effort to address the issues surrounding late-run mortality. There have been extensive studies implemented since 2001. Very large budget, $1 to $1.2 million specific projects implemented to address these in 2002, 2003, subsequently in 2006. So very easy to demonstrate that there's been significant movement in addressing the issue of in-river mortality.
What about the recommendation that more extensive stock assessment studies on all Fraser River sockeye stocks be done?
It's difficult for me to understand what the writers of the recommendation might have been pointing at, but I think there are a couple of things that clearly overlap with the late-run mortality evaluation that has extended much broader to Fraser sockeye run timing groups in general. So a lot of the work on the telemetry extended onto summer run stocks and early summer run stocks. So there has been work there through the academic institutes, in particular collaborating with UBC, Dr. Hinch, and his group working on energetics. There's been a substantial amount of work looking at issues affecting migration in the Fraser. We also have added a fair bit of environmental assessment associated with water temperatures and predicting potential migratory success. That was brought on sort of in the 2000 timeline. So that has been developed and is going forward and playing a significant role in management at present. When I take that recommendation down to the more narrowly focused stock level and reflect back on some of the comments that we've been discussing earlier today, like evaluation of nursery lake trophic status, the research into incubation habitat, fry programs. We haven't made as much progress there. In fact, probably less work being done there than say in the 95 to 2000 timeline.
I think you also have to consider in 2002, you've touched on a number of the sensitivities a few times today. That was the quenelle year. That was the period of the Fraser pinks. That was the year that, when I was just thinking of another discussion we had earlier, reductions in budget that year was a major drop. I think it was about $2.5 million because of the drop in the, what was that program called?
CFAR.
CFAR, yeah,
Canadian Fisheries Adjustment and Realignment.
It was another special allocation for about 5 years, and that terminated. So there were a number of sensitivities at that time, but I think that Timber's response is appropriate. And when you look at the coverage that one of your exhibits on the budget addressed us recently, and we've acknowledged a few times, I mean, Fraser sockeye, as much as we can put into it, we put that as a first priority, and so there wasn't a great deal more you could do without having significant impacts on other stock assessments in the region.
Thank you. And then staying in Exhibit 14 at page 246, the WAPEL 2005 report, recommendation number 8. It recommended that knowledge gaps regarding quantitative estimates of spawning fish should be investigated. In response, the department has said that it restructured its Pacific Science program to have a dedicated focus on salmon stock assessment and scientific research. Dr. Riddell, what was involved in that?
And so we're talking 2005?
Right.
Well, there was a small reorganization, but I wouldn't call that significant. That was the year that we did form the SAFE division. There was extensive collaboration going on with other departmental groups. There was extensive work on the late run Fraser sockeye, including much of the research that we've seen recently in a science publication by Dr. Christy Miller-Saunders. So there was a lot of work going on as described in the paragraph here, but we didn't change the stock assessment program substantially. That was the year that I took over. And that there were some reorganizations within the Fraser, so we went to a single stock assessment group within the Fraser River. But we didn't change any real people there, and that is some a little bit of reporting, and nothing that I would qualify as major at all.
Okay. In terms of long-term monitoring programs, we've talked a lot so far in these hearings about different programs that have been in place since the 1940s or earlier. And I take it there's significant value in long-term monitoring for science and for management. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. Should it be the Department of Fisheries and Oceans who is responsible for long-term monitoring programs and maintaining long-term monitoring programs in relation to Fraser River sockeye?
Well, I would say it's even more general than Fraser River sockeye. To be honest, I've made this point several times in my career that universities are not a center that wants to do long-term collection of data. They want to do specific tasks, do an investigation and publish and move on. The legacy of the Department of Fisheries as a government agency really is one of having good quality data for long-term monitoring. So if we do want to monitor the effects of climate change through time, then we have the baseline that we can look at the effects on various populations of salmon. I think it's a core responsibility of the department to maintain legacies of long-term data.
Do you have anything to add to that, Mr. Whitehouse?
Other than I agree completely, nothing additional.
Are there any, this is my final question for each of you, is there anything that you think the Department of Fisheries and Oceans could be doing better with respect to stock assessment needed for Fraser River sockeye management? So basically I'm asking you, are there recommendations that you would like to leave with the Commissioner before we complete?
Well, I hope it's not 10 words or less, because I probably have a number of thoughts. Well, number one, I think you've heard that in stock assessment on the Pacific region, Fraser sockeye salmon is number one, right? And a number of the other resources have obviously over time suffered to some extent because we have tried to direct money to Fraser sockeye. Have we done enough? Well, you've also heard that we could probably do more in ecological studies of the large lakes and looking at the effects of productivity over time. In terms of explanation for what's happened over the past decade, I think we need to recognize that the department needs to put more into early marine survival and likely now downstream survival of smolts leaving the lakes. I'm not sure that we can do a lot more in smolt enumeration. We could probably do some more in fry evaluations in the fall. I don't think you need to do a lot more in the DNA studies because we've done extensive work there. But we definitely are lacking in understanding of what's limiting marine survival in their first few months at sea, and how the animal actually utilizes the Straits of Georgia. If a lot of the mortality is occurring then, what are the mortality mechanisms? How quickly do they leave the strait? There's quite a bit of debate on that at this moment. And that we do have some tools we can try and apply to improve our understanding there. And that, so I think that in terms of freshwater assessment of escapement work, we can probably improve our understanding about the utilization of freshwater habitats and spawning grounds. We're going to hear discussion about the overspawning and that, so we can do more to understand the ecological impact of large numbers of spawners. Those are things we can do right now. And that, but we need to have new programs, I believe, in the Strait of Georgia so that we can really address these concerns about early marine survival.
Thank you. Mr. Whitehouse?
I agree with Brian. I would also like to make a couple of additional comments, because it's easy to lose track of the potential risks that you're exposed to in looking at accommodating needs for new information emerging from specific management issues, climate change, etc. Very fundamental to the ability to assess what's going on in Fraser sockeye management is the escapement time series. It is a critical baseline against which everything else that we collect is evaluated. You can't, we have to be careful not to think that we can trade off moving to the marine environment at the cost of dropping escapement monitoring, for example. It's quite critical that in order to that have much meaning and explanatory power, by moving to enhanced lake assessment or enhanced assessment of survival in the marine areas, that we have that key fundamental, the escapement. That's the ultimate signal that the fish send us as a result of their experience of environment or exposure to harvest. That escapement forms the platform. Recognizing what has gone on in the past 50 years without the escapement information that we have would be much more difficult, and it's questionable whether it would be doable at all. So escapement monitoring forms a backbone upon which the rest of management is really built. And then I agree with Brian, strategically there are a number of other areas that have the potential to add significant explanatory power to the data that we collect to improve our understanding of factors that limit production. Early marine life history is clearly, in current science thinking, leaping out as one area that has a significant potential explanatory power. But I think there are a number of examples within the Fraser River watershed in freshwater itself that need to be seriously considered, and elements like freshwater assessment of nursery lakes, elements associated with evaluating incubation habitat quality and its ability to accept very large escapements like we just saw last fall, are also important to consider in the mix. I don't think going to the marine environment exclusively is a single fix, and I don't think looking in freshwater is going to be a fix in terms of explanatory power. We really need to look at where the risks lay, where the information gaps lay, and where we're likely going to be able to actually generate meaningful add-on value in terms of the data we collect. Things like the acoustic tagging program on smolts have a significant potential, and from information perspective, significant value in a leading forecast in terms of survival, but they have to be doable. So I think it's critical that we take a very holistic and ecosystem-based approach to evaluating where pressures are. You need to be extremely forward-looking around the type of processes that may represent change to Fraser sockeye. A very good example is the recent clarification of en route losses due to the marine area telemetry program. If you look at the management system, it's based on catch plus escapement. And the significant gap, and one of the major problems between 2002 and present, is the fact that, at least for a significant period of that stanza, there was losses of fish en route that represented bias. I come back to my comment earlier with respect to accuracy. We did not have a good handle on what was going on. The research pieces were needed. They answered those questions. We have to be forward-looking in order to understand where those pressures may come from. What are the likely drivers from climate change perspective? Shifts in lake productivity, shifts in marine productivity in the Strait of Georgia. And how we incorporate those, I think, are critical to any source of recommendations to go forward in supporting the development and support of the information collecting system to support management.
This Commission of Inquiry was established because of the significant decline in 2009, followed by a larger than expected abundance in 2010. In terms of your comments, given the bookends of the significant decline and a larger than expected abundance, do the programs that you and Dr. Riddell have been describing here today, are they satisfactory in dealing with what appears to be two extremes happening a year apart? In other words, this last piece that you've just described, is that ultimately going to help to address these kinds of situations? But what will it take to do that? I don't quite understand what more could be done in the context of the programs you've described and the record keeping you've described to address these kinds of extremes.
Well, I'll lead off. I think that if we had a rigorous early marine survival study, that you would have seen the explanation for both years in one place. Now, I mean, that's a limited number of scientists that believe this at this point, but I think that the inferences being drawn from just the marine surveys in the Strait of Georgia and the consistency of the change in the abundance of the juvenile sockeye we've seen and other salmon species as well with these marine conditions, and with better understanding of how the sockeye use the Strait of Georgia in terms of period of residence, and with monitoring the biological productivity of the Strait of Georgia, and that we could have possibly explained both of these events. I may be a little overly naive on this, but I just see the information that's been accumulating really leads me to think that we're missing a major signal in the early marine survival. And that in terms of explaining the difference that you've pointed out, Mr. Commissioner, I agree with Timber in long-term assessments, and of course, last week we talked about the Count on Salmon program and the use of radio tags. You know that I recommended building that program. I see that as a way of explaining the impacts within the river, but it doesn't explain your question in terms of what caused the difference in marine production. Whereas I think the early marine survival is the first place we should look. Some people disagree with me that it's that narrowly focused. I'm open to being wrong in this case, but I don't see any merit of starting a study in the ocean where it's extremely costly to be out there and it's extremely difficult to recognize Fraser sockeye. Whereas in the Strait of Georgia, you can recognize you can recognize Fraser sockeye, and that we can do the work. It's confined. We can use small vessels from communities to do much of the work. I think we could make major progress in understanding with a focused program in the Straits. But only because of exactly your sort of question. What is it that could possibly explain such events in 2 years?
Thank you. Does Mr. Whitehouse, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think he's thinking.
It's hard to tell when a scientist is thinking. They're always thinking.
We're always thinking.
Thank you.
It's difficult not to agree with Brian in terms of the,
But
in terms of the gap. as you've framed it, the $64 million question here is, what additional information could we have collected, or could we have been collecting in a systematic way that might, and this I consider it to be a leading indicator. We need to understand more early in the life history the factors that are influencing production. I think there's a very good reason to focus on the Strait of Georgia. It represents a very critical time in the life history, that transition from freshwater to marine residency. There's a lot of interaction in terms of competitors, predators that are new to sockeye. That the strait is also highly dynamic and undergoing a number of different changes associated with drivers from outside and inside its basin. It is the logical first place to look. There are also, and just to confuse the situation, I can point to circumstances where on a stock-specific basis, and I think the key to the approach that Brian's suggesting is there's synchrony amongst all Fraser stocks on different time steps in terms of their decline in production. There's synchrony that began in the late 60s for some stocks, in the mid 80s, and early 90s for others, suggesting there's got to be something common in their life history that is resulting in this depressed production, and then boom, a spike, a turnaround of 180 degrees in 1 year. Something substantial is occurring. But I can also point to examples where there's been flip-flops of those magnitudes within the freshwater environment as well. Choco represents a system for which in this past decade we have seen absolute peak levels of smoke production for no apparent reason. No significant habitat change, or at least nothing that you would identify as being clear as having a positive impact on sockeye production, yet it's pushed sockeye production through the roof with respect to a couple of brood years. In the same decade, and for stock not really much more than a couple hundred kilometers away in the Quesnel system, we've seen back-to-back very high recruitments of adults, high escapement levels, and what is akin to recruitment collapses off of back-to-back large escapements. So there are processes operating at both levels of scale, at individual lakes and on all stocks in common. The likely explanation is that for the big downturn in production and then this big turnaround, there has to be something that's happening common to all of them. The marine environment is the place to look. But we cannot forget that there are processes that are changing within the watershed that are going to have an impact on production on the local stock, or to use the terminology that's more appropriate now under WSP, at the CU level.
Mr. Commissioner, I should really quickly add to that. I think given the recent science papers coming out, we really can't forget about extensive study of the fish health concern, because this could really have a major long-term effect if there's something going on here. We clearly don't understand that yet.
Hearing we now recess for 10 minutes.